Researchers divide scholastic philosophy into three philosophical periods, usually known as the pre-scholastic or early scholastic period, the scholastic or high scholastic period, and the late scholastic period. The early or pre-scholastic period includes most notably St. Anselm, and is generally thought to run from about the date of his birth in 1033 through his death in 1109 up until about 1250 ADE. Classic or high scholasticism is thought to run from about 1250 ADE to about 1350 ADE and includes such figures as St. Thomas Aquinas, who's pictured in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. The late scholastic period commonly refers to a time period from approximately 1350 all the way up to about 1650, and it includes such figures as William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. As a movement, scholasticism really designates the interests, the influences, and the methodologies that are employed by and studied by primarily educated religious and noble figures, first in the courts and in the church, and then later in universities. And by later, I do mean later. Universities don't start to be founded in any significant number in Europe until about the 1200s. So, for instance, probably the oldest university is the University of Bologna, starting operation around 1088, but not even granted a charter until 1158. Now, these universities were staffed by and attended primarily by clergy for the purposes of educating people who were going to serve as members of the church. Now, the subject matters of these schools consisted primarily of Latin translations from Greek or from Arabic into Latin, that is, of Aristotle's writings, of commentaries thereon, and of miscellaneous other closely related texts. So Europe was relatively insulated from the thriving cultures outside of Europe at this time. So the Muslim caliphates, for example, were not in what sometimes derisively is called the Dark Ages. When referring to the Middle Ages, there was a burgeoning cultural and scientific mathematical awakening in the Islamic caliphates. There was also a great deal of activity in China, but this was pretty isolated from Europe. And so for this reason, the Europeans were basically relying upon a small number of cultural artifacts that they had inherited largely from the Romans, who had inherited many of them from the Greeks. Now, a lot of the Roman science, culture, knowledge have been destroyed in the sacking of Roman cities and the burning of Roman libraries. And so there really wasn't a ton of matter for this intellectual movement. Scholasticism made the most of it, however, and using this methodology of analyzing existent scholarly opinions on a question or on a set of questions, and the idea being to create a clear set of lines of argumentation representing different opinions, then exploring the contradictions and the potential for reconciliation. So this was largely intellectually a pretty conservative movement that focused on understanding existent writings and not so much on generating new knowledge. And it was primarily concerned with using dialectical disputation and not with exploring things through experiment or observation. Now, this was going to change in part because Europe started to change as well. And scholars generally hold that the European Renaissance began in the 14th century in the city-state of Florence, which is located in Tuscany, Italy. And it was fueled in large part by an increase in commerce. So with stable or more stable governments, even in the form of city-states, you start to see trade and commerce start to emerge with the Muslim caliphates to the east and to the south. And with that comes an increase in money and an increase in ideological exchange, which gives rise to an increase in artistic and religious activity, and that's all fueled by this extra money that's coming in. And so this period from the 14th to the 17th century brings this increasing flow of money from commerce, of artistic and religious activity being fueled by that money, as well as exchange of ideas directly and indirectly with other cultures that were previously not so common. Now, all of this leads to increased scientific activity, in part for purposes of engineering and warfare, but in part because of the stimulation that all this money brings in. And that eventually leads to what historians refer to as the scientific revolution. Now, historians generally associate the beginning of the scientific revolution with the publication of two important works that dramatically change the way that educated individuals can at least potentially conceptualize the universe and their place therein. So after his death, that is the death of Copernicus, a German publishing firm publishes his privately circulated manuscript called Commentarialis, or Little Commentary. And they publish it under the title that we're familiar with, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And they published that in 1543. Now, this work is significant for a number of reasons. One is that it draws heavily on data and ideas that were developed in the Muslim caliphates to the east, who've been doing a lot of astronomy in this particular time leading up to 1543. It also changes the framework for conceiving of the universe in the solar system. So prior to this, the solar system is considered to be revolving around, the whole universe is considered to be revolving around the Earth. So we have this very Earth-centric conception of the universe, so that everything seems to revolve around the Earth. But with Copernicus, there's this introduction of a heliocentric framework for thinking about the solar system. And it's got all these predictive advantages that the previous cosmology doesn't have, including being much simpler. But it does also have this side effect that, first of all, it contradicts the ancient texts that the scholastics have been carefully and systematically evaluating and thinking about, and it also changes the structure of the universe in a way that makes it look like the universe isn't revolving around the Earth, that human beings aren't the center of existence. They're merely on a little dot floating around a larger sun, floating around a very, very large and relatively indifferent universe. The second publication that helps to shape the intellectual framework for the scientific revolution is the publication of De Humana Corpus Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, written by Andreas Vesalius, who was a physician who was born in current-day Brussels. It's a 7-volume text on anatomy. Now, you may think, oh my God, who needs a 7-volume text who's not a medical student? Yeah. But also, there just weren't many accurate anatomical texts, and this represents a dramatic increase in both the detail and the accuracy of our understanding of the human body. So it's published in 1555. Now, both Vesalius's work as well as Copernicus's work challenge traditional theories of humanity in the universe. And as a result, they also challenge the authority figures in their respective areas, particularly the clergy. And so this period sees a rapid transformation of human knowledge in astronomy, in biology, in mathematics, and in physics, together with the renewed emphasis on observation and experimentation in these areas. And this runs hard against the relatively conservative and unempirical methodology and ideology of scholasticism.